What's up guys, ZiSotto here, and today we're talking about Paragon and Smite. More specifically, we're talking about a transition from Paragon to Smite. Unfortunately, as many of you may know, or as some of you may directly be affected by, Paragon is closing down later this year, and Smite is fortunately going into Season 5 right now, so there's a good time right now to switch over games or try out Smite if you want to. I myself have played a little bit of Paragon. Unfortunately, my PC for the most part wasn't the best to actually play it that much, so my experience is limited. That's why I brought someone with me who has a lot more experience with that game. And that is LHS, the Zacdick, or whatever name he wants to go by right now. Hi.
Hello, Duke Sloth. LHS is the preferred nomenclature at this point, I think.
All right, but as we have those different names you went by or go by at some point, your Twitter is at the Zacdick, your YouTube as youtube.com/LordHighSummoner, and your Discord, I don't know what the actual link for that is, but all the links will also be down below. He has helped me a great deal with this video. He has done most of the information side for this video, so feel free to check those things out and give him a follow there or a sub or whatever you can do on the respective platform. And with that, let's get into the info. We're going to pitch this a bit back and forth. I'm going to pitch in where I know stuff, and Zach is going to take over the rest. When we talk about Paragon versus Smite, it's first of all important to go a little bit into the differences between the two games that are there in terms of general gameplay, and then later on we look a little bit more into specific lanes as well as the specific characters and how you could, for example, transition from a Paragon character to a similar Smite character. Tell us a little bit more about the general differences.
So one of the biggest differences going from Paragon into Smite, and really any MOBA into Smite, is the blast hitting. So in Paragon, in League, and all those other games, there's a really big onus put on to last hitting. In Paragon, the waves were a little bit tankier, and that's how you primarily did a lot of your farm. You wanted to get those last hits. That's how you measured your farm and your success. But in Smite, it's a little different. Yes, there is bonuses to getting those last hits, but by level 2, especially level 3, you're mostly just one-shot clearing the wave with that ability, so you're just getting last hits without having to try. Whereas Paragon, the laning phase was a lot more drawn out, and it was more about babysitting the lane and trying to just really get those last hits, and that's going to be a big difference moving from Paragon to Smite.
All right. In the same context, there is also a difference for the towers, which is something that's worth noting, in that you will still get gold when a tower hits a minion, but it is drastically less. Like, it's a fraction of what you would normally get, but you will still get the full experience. As such, sometimes there are strategies applies to freezing waves, or otherwise just shoving the wave under the enemy tower in order to either decide if they should get more immediate potential to trade you, or just deny their farm, or whichever you want to go for in that particular place. Then we also have the Gold Fury. We have a similar objective in Paragon. What's that, LHS?
So they've had a few different ones. In the current set, they don't really have the Gold Fury per se. They have something called a Fangtooth, which is more like a League objective. It gives you like a stacking buff. But before that, they had the Raptors. And the Raptors were basically like the Gold Fury and a couple Harpies, and that's really what it is. So it's a really early to mid game objective. It gives you a bunch of gold, and in Smite, the Gold Fury, exactly that. It's an early to mid game objective, gives you a bunch of gold. As the game goes on, gives you more gold, but it also takes less precedent off of other things that are on the map.
What's interesting in that context is the Gold Fury is not quite alone. We also have the Oracles around it or next to it. The Oracles are basically ward minions. If you kill both Oracles, then you get a vision of the Gold Fury for a while, as if you placed a ward there that the enemy team can't remove. On the other hand, you have to be aware that the Oracles are super tanky, and especially as a jungler early on, it's a very risky objective to take on your own. In Season 5, the Oracles have been buffed drastically, so they really aren't that easy to kill. And then we also have a bigger objective, that is the Fire Giant. The equivalent for that in Paragon would be Orb Prime. What is the difference here?
So the Orb Prime is essentially almost beat for beat the Fire Giant. Earlier on in Paragon's career, there was a whole dunking mechanic that was so out there and different from what Smite's ever done. But luckily, that's been taken away, and we have a more one-to-one comparison. And it's just you kill it, and it's a very late game thing, and it gives you a 10% bonus damage. It restores 1.5% of your max health and 1.5 of your max mana every second if no damage is taken. And then nearby friendly minions have their max health increased by 12%. So a little bit different in the buff side, but the Fire Giant also offers very similar buffs, except for the friendly minions part.
And then at the same time, we also have another objective next to the Fire Giant once again. And in this case, that's the Pyromancer, which is a kind of a mid-game objective, gives you extra movement speed coming from base. It is of somewhat similar strength to the Gold Fury, and often you will see one team contesting the Gold Fury and the other team deciding to go for Pyromancer, or the other way around. Another crucial difference outside of that in Smite is that crowd control doesn't necessarily mean that you're dead already, but there are multiple means to counter crowd control. We get more into that later, and ways to cleanse it basically, or avoid it in the first place. With that, we can go a little bit more into the lanes and how they are played out in Smite. I'll go over this part, and Zach will talk a little bit more about the specific characters afterwards. So solo lane in Smite is what the title says, a 1v1 lane. It's a symmetrical lane. Basically, all lanes are mostly symmetrical at this point. Some of them are mirrored the other way around, but that's about it. In solo lane, you will mostly find warrior types of characters, sometimes guardians. There are outliers, but generally you'll see mostly tanky gods here. Many of them can trade for extended times, slap box back and forth, and have good early damage and decent early clear. They will potentially fall off late game or go into more crowd control and frontline focus in late game. There's a buff next to that lane, and that is blue buff, which will give you cooldown reduction and restores some mana. In mid lane, you also have a 1v1 scenario for the most part. You will have the jungler come in sometimes. So generally a 1v1, also symmetrical. It's mages, but you will see flex picks here. There are some hunters that can also be played quite well, like ability-based hunters. And typically the characters that are here are focused around high burst, a little bit of utility, AoE damage, crowd control, and just any sort of damage. Not all of them just go purely by burst. Some also have like ticking damage that lasts a few seconds, but it's still really, really high. And most of them are very squishy. In jungle, you will find junglers. Well done. Most of them are responsible for clearing camps across the map. They will occasionally pop into lanes, but that's not their main job anymore, at least. They used to share a lot more, now you'll see them more on their own. They have the speed buff, assisting them in clearing the jungle through movement speed, in 15 increase in movement speed. Typically, those characters are assassins. There are some outliers as usual, some mages, for example. Also relatively squishy, sometimes a bit more bruiser, and also obviously damage dealers as such. Sometimes ability based, sometimes more hyper carry, basic attack focused. That depends a bit on what you want to play. In support, we have guardians. Those ones pick up the purple buff quite often. That's a buff that reduces the enemy protections, both flat and percentage wise. And they are the main tanks basically. You build items that support your team in various ways. You often have the main responsibility to build wards or buy wards, though everyone on the team should be buying wards in almost any situation. Wards are very crucial overall. They have a lot of crowd control, a little less damage, but often high early damage to help out with the clear early on. And they do rotate more in Smite than they do in Paragon. They do still a fair bit of early babysitting, but the longer the game goes or the more it progresses, the more you will see them rotating out of that lane too. And then last but not least, we have the ADC, the hunters, most of the time, sometimes some carry mages as well. Once again, very squishy. They don't do a lot of damage early, but they do an insane amount of damage late game. Do a lot of damage, a lot of DPS as well, so a lot of trading potential there too. Often sustain very well too through lifesteal. Exceptions obviously is this tier. Some hunters should not be undervalued in that regard. For example, Uller, who's got an insane amount of early game damage and falls off a little bit more late game. A buff that we haven't mentioned so far is the red buff. The red buff is a damage increase buff that can be picked up by both the mid laner and the ADC, depending on who you want to play. With that, we'll pass it on to Zach, who will talk a little bit more about the comparison between the heroes and the gods, and I will always give a little bit more insight on the Smite side of things here. Let's begin.
So, looking at the roster of characters for Paragon, there's a lot of stuff where you can say there's like a one-to-one comparison, especially with abilities and some of the ultimates. One of the things that became really apparent as I looked through it is a lot of the carries, the ADC type roles in Paragon, were really unique, and they don't really have a one-to-one. So if you're a Paragon player who was a carry main, coming to Smite's going to be a little bit more difficult for you because there's nobody that really feels the same outside of like at least one character. So everybody else, there's at least one hero that kind of connects to a god. So we'll start with Countess. Countess is a really interesting character. She was a burst caster, which is essentially just like a burst jungler in what Smite would be. She could jump onto your squishies, return to where she jumped from. Basically, she could just jump and completely shred a squishy down to the ground. Very much an assassin jungler type role.
Right, in Smite, we have some similar characters. We have BASTET, who has the possibility to jump on a target and pounce back to the original jump spot, also an assassin. We have Loki, the prime burst assassin that is just basically teleporting on targets, dealing high amounts of damage and getting out afterwards. And we also have Daji, who's got a similar movement ability with her teleport, and also, once again, a very high burst assassin. All three of them fall under the typical assassin jungler category, though Loki can be flexed into solo, for example, as well.
Next up, we have Crunch, and there's not really a one-to-one for Crunch. It's more of a play style and mindset. Crunch wants to control a fight and be a bruiser, and he's essentially a Raven or a Tyr. He wants to get right up close to you, punch you, just like Raven does. He wants to get his abilities off, root you, control you if he can. Same thing with Tyr. He wants to get his combos off and really displace you and make your life as uncomfortable as possible. So if you are a Crunch player, you're really going to like warriors. And, you know, I'm sorry you missed out on the warrior jungler phase because you probably really would have liked that. Next up, we have Decker. And she has one giant thing in common with Smite, and her ult is a cage.
And in Smite, we have Odin basically doing the same thing. Odin is a character that focuses around, well, high early burst with most of his abilities, but the really unique part that he has is a massive cage. The cage can be passed through by allies, but not by enemies, and it reduces the enemy healing as well as attack speed.
Up next, we have Feng Mao. He's got executes. Their executes in Paragon are a little bit different than the executes in Smite. In Paragon, it was a flat number threshold, but in Smite, it's a percentage HP instead.
And of that, we have multiple characters. On one hand, we have THANATOS, who can take to the skies in his ultimate and then dunk down on targets and kill them if they're below that percentage threshold. Whereas Ao Kuang does it a little differently. He will be able to just execute a target that's right in front of him if they get low enough health. Once again, you have to keep in mind that counters work differently in Smite, so none of these executes is guaranteed.
Gadget is one of my favorite characters for Paragon. She has some interesting stuff. She's got mines she places that then kind of choose between a minion or an enemy hero. She's got a slow, and she's got a giant ult that does damage in a circle. Gadget is the circles on circles meme for Paragon. Here in Smite, we have our own circles on circles memes. The two biggest ones that come to mind for Gadget comparisons would be ZEUS and KUKULKAN. KUKULKAN has the ticking whirlwind damage, which is sort of similar to the little robot that Gadget throws in if you get cut in it, but KUKULKAN's a little bit stronger. And then with Gadget, you've also got her mine, which deals a lot of damage, similar in nature to a ZEUS 1 detonate or a ZEUS Aegis shield throw. A little bit different, but a lot of the same stuff applies. ZEUS ult is definitely more of a one-to-one for Gadget than KUKULKAN is with his Spirit of the Nine Winds. But if you like circles, and you like circles on circles, I feel like you'll like ZEUS. Moving there, we have one of the main characters from Paragon. We've got Gideon, who did a lot of interesting things. His ult pulled you in, trapped you down, slowed you, and did damage to you. And he also could portal around the map a little bit, which was really interesting because of the verticality of Paragon. We have some similar gods in Smite.
On one hand, in Smite, we have Hades, who's got a rather similar ultimate, a massive AoE that drags in enemies and basically shields up Hades at the same time a little bit. A lot of potential in that. The ultimate that Hades basically plays around, though it is sometimes criticized as being a little bit too easy to avoid. On the other hand, we also have Janus. Janus has the portals too. Janus portals can be used in two ways. They can be used on the ground directly, but that will lead to you only falling through the portal and landing in the same spot. This can be used to deal damage or delay certain attacks or avoid certain aerial attacks, for example. At the same time, he can also put the portal on the wall. If he puts the portal on the wall, then he can portal through the wall and end up on the other side. If he does that, he can use that portal himself, or an ally can use it, but not both. His ultimate works a little differently, but we'll come back to Janus at a later point and talk about that.
Up next, we have Greystone. Greystone is a offlaner, solo laner, who just doesn't die. His ultimate is the ability, it's a self-revive. So think, if you're coming from Smite, think a self-Kepri, but it's a little bit different. He also just presses W at you, and just never stops pressing W at you. Dude, can you think of a warrior solo laner in Smite that just presses W and never dies?
Yeah, he's gonna press W and some more because he's gonna pull you in as well, and that's Hercules. Hercules is a warrior that's very much known for being unkillable. He's got a self-heal that heals him in multiple instances, also depending on how much damage he has taken. This was changed a while ago, but still kind of works like that. He is countered very much by anti-heal, which many people forget, so especially if you're a new player, that's something worth keeping in mind. Build some anti-heal, and Herc has got a lot of problems. But at the same time, outside of that, his kit is also pretty potent because for a warrior, he has very strong means of still dealing damage to you. He can pull you in, he can push you around and stun you, and he also has a massive boulder as his ultimate that he can throw at you.
The next couple we're going to get into are more feels like and only certain abilities kind of being the same in Smite, and we're really kind of getting into the amalgamation characters. So the next one's Grux, who has the same ability as Susano that pulls you in at close range, and he kind of flip-flops between this tanky character or an assassin burst kind of character. Aesthetically, he reminds me of SOBEK, and he does have a cleave attack, and he does have some knockup, but he's not quite SOBEK. So if you're coming from Paragon and you see SOBEK, you might think it's a very similar. I caution you, I say try it out, but I don't think he's going to offer you the same type of character that you're really expecting. Next up is Iggy and Scorch, the turret character from Paragon. We also have a turret character a little bit different in Vulcan. With Iggy and Scorch, you can place multiple turrets, and then all of the turrets in your ultimate fire on one person or multiple people in rapid succession. Vulcan, on the other hand, has his giant ultimate that does a bunch of AoE damage. So again, getting to a little bit different feels, but kind of similar abilities here and there. And then we come, I think, to the most one-to-one character between Paragon and Smite, Kallari. We've got invisibility. We've got a global ult that jumps on a single target and murders them. Apart from the global part, who is our Kallari?
It's definitely Loki. We've talked about Loki briefly before this, but in this case, we have the invisibility, we have the ultimate that still makes you jump on a target in a similar fashion. It is not global, unless it's bugged once again, but generally speaking, that's the main difference. The ultimate isn't global, but the burst is definitely there, and the rest of his kit is basically mostly revolving around damage in some sort as well.
Again, another character that doesn't have a real true one-to-one is Chimera, but he has a sort of one-to-one, a character that kind of mimics his mindset and play style. Chimera wants to be 1v1. He wants to fight you. He wants to be all up in your face. A lot like Arachne. Arachne 1v1 can do a lot of damage, but you can also be shut down a little bit easier than you want to. So if you are a Chimera player who loves being in the jungle, loves ganking people, loves being able to fight into a 1v1 situation really well, you'll probably like Arachne as well. Next, we have Quang, who has the ability to throw and teleport to his weapon, sort of similar to Smite's own Shock.
Not much more to say about that guy. His main deal is the teleport. He also has the option to throw out his weapon, his axe, and use it as a slow by using his other ability, which is a heal and a slow. And in that case, the slow will not only be around him, how it usually is, but also around the place where he threw his axe. And then he's got a massive AoE ultimate silence, but the biggest comparison between them is definitely the option to teleport to your weapon.
Next, we have one of the more frustrating characters of Paragon in Lieutenant Bellica. Bellica is an anti-mage, all about shutting down your lane opposition, whereas Bellica does it through mana drain and things like that. We have the Smite equivalent in Nox. In Paragon, whenever you saw a Bellica, you kind of did your sigh. The same way as when you're playing your Joust game and you see the tryhards picking Nox. Nox is all about shutting you down, silencing you, doing damage, rooting you, and just not letting you do what you want to do. So if you are the type of person that doesn't want other people to have fun in your games, and you played Lieutenant Bellica in Paragon, I'm pretty sure you're going to have a wonderful time playing Nox in Smite. Then comes MURDOCK. MURDOCK is an interesting character. He is a carry, but he has a very interesting ult. His ult is a global snipe, and you don't need vision to use it. As long as you have your ult, you can fire in any direction on the map.
In Smite, we have some similar gods in that regard. We have Neith, who is a carry and has a global ultimate where she can freely aim at any target directly as long as there is vision of the target. Any god, I gotta specify that. Ra, on the other hand, has the snipe without needing vision for it, so at the same time you'll have to hit the target and it's not an auto aim. But Ra's ultimate is limited in its range, it just does a lot of damage. The true comparison here is probably Janus, who we mentioned earlier, the portal god. This guy can snipe all across the map, and while there's some restriction when you're in your starting point in the base, other than that, you can deal a lot of damage to anyone wherever they are. It also allows you to travel the map and help out your teammates, as it creates portals in all the walls, and everyone can use those. Everyone on your team, that is.
Next up, we got a few supports. First up is Muriel, who shields and protects her allies. She can go up into the air, choose a target, give them some shields, and get them out of a sticky situation.
In Smite, we have two characters who kind of do parts of these. With Gap, that's the shields, that's GEB. And the other one is Athena, who has an ultimate that allows her to teleport to an ally's location and deal damage when she lands.
Next up, my personal favorite character in Paragon. We've got Narbash, the hippie orc. Narbash does a lot. He does AoE healing. He does movement speed adjustments. He stuns and locks down a character. He has a knockup. He does a lot, and there's a lot of different pieces that match up with him in Smite.
One of the pieces would be Sylvanus. Sylvanus shares Nabar's affinity for AoE heals and also has a knockup in his ultimate. Fafnir, on the other hand, has his Thunk, the hammer in his case, that he throws to stun enemies, so ranged stun. Cerberus also has kind of a ranged stun, though that is more conditional. You have to have something else activated in a specific range. And he also has some sort of strange AoE knockup.
And while all these tank supports share his abilities, none of them share his amazing personality. What I personally did after I played Paragon for a long time playing Narbash is I started playing Raijin as his War Chief skin and started cosplaying as Narbash in the support role as Raijin. I don't completely recommend it, but if you need your Narbash fixed, that's about as close as you're gonna get aesthetically. Then we've got FaZe. FaZe was an interesting character in Paragon where she could link two characters and she would give HP 5. Her ultimate would then also give you a bunch of HP 5 and mana regen, as well as attack speed and movement speed and all this sort of wonderful buff stuff. She also had a slow beam / heal and a blind.
In Smite, we have Aphrodite, who can link to an ally, give them a little bit of MP5 that way, I think, and also the possibility to heal them through another ability, but she cannot pull people to her location. Artio, on the other hand, is more of a bruiser-style tank healer. She has the option to use a beam to slow enemies and in the process heal herself as well. If she lands the full beam, she will also root the target.
Next up, we have Rampage, who really only shares one aspect of his kit with somebody in Smite, and that's that his ult causes him to grow and get big and have a bunch of health regen. And that's pretty much just one-to-one Vamana. That's what Vamana does. Both of these characters are both kind of bruiser, tanky characters, whereas Rampage could be more of a jungler in Paragon. Vamana is more of a bruiser soul laner. He just wants to fight you. Next up, we have Richter, who has a hook pull and lots of confirmable CC in his kit.
When it comes to the hook pull, we have Sylvanus, who can pull enemies towards him and set up a lot of damage that way at least. And Kumbhakana, on the other hand, who is the king of crowd control spam. Just every ability in his kit except this one is some sort of crowd control, some sort of heavy crowd control. Question is if you can pull it off, because it's very, very telegraphed.
Next we have Sereth, who was a melee sort of hyper carry. There's not a lot of that in Smite. We do have Kali and Mercury, who are both, you know, two jungler assassin types who want to engage with you and punch you in the face and really melt you down. Whereas Sereth was a little bit tankier than that and could deny you from hitting her and doing damage. Kali and Merc are more about just getting into your face and shredding through your health very quickly. Next up we have Shinbi, and Shinbi doesn't have a real one-to-one, but does do a couple things similar to Smite. She has a double dash and is basically used as a tank shredder, and she also adds stacks and does damage via those stacks with their ultimate.
In Smite, we have Nemesis, who also has that double dash and is considered the primary tank shredder among assassins, maybe along with Bakasura. And on the other hand, we also have Sakat, who massively plays around dots and activates different things with her abilities that she can proc later on through basic attacks, different poisons.
Next up, for you carries out there, we have the most one-to-one carry. We've got Sparrow. From an aesthetic place, from a kit place, she's very similar to one of Smite's premier ADCs. Maybe not premier anymore, but what she does a rain of arrows. She has a self-steroid, and she gets buffs for hitting basics. Duke, does that sound like anybody we know?
That sounds like Artemis, who does all of those things as well. She gets a buff for hitting basics that increase her crit chance as well, which is going to be very interesting coming in the upcoming meta, because crit is going to be a bigger thing as well. She's got an attack speed steroid, and she's got a rain of arrows.
Everybody has that one god that does more damage than they probably should. In Smite, the premier tanky damage guy is Bacchus, sometimes Kabrakan, but Bacchus is just a tank that does way too much damage. If you like that style of play, you probably played Steel in Paragon. Steel was also a guy who was a tank that just did way too much damage. So if that type of playstyle appeals to you, try to look at Bacchus or Kabrakan, or just play around with all the Guardians, because Guardians in Smite have just wonky base numbers that can be exploited through power items. So if you want to be sort of tanky and lots of damage, look at the Guardian tab a little bit. Next up we have the Fae and Ares. Very different playstyles, whereas the Fae is more of a burst caster that can flex into the support role. Ares is a very aggressive support, wants to do damage, wants to CC you. They have the same ult where they pull you into the center. They, however, do not play very similar outside of that. So if you like that ult as a concept, check out Ares, but if you're looking to be a main caster damage person, probably look more towards mid laners such as Poseidon would probably be a better bet for you.
And with that, we're done with the characters. But before we end this video, there are a few concerns we should at least get out the way. And that's something that's, you know, been floating around the community for a while, coming up ever so often basically, and that is, should you be worried that Smite is going to cease development for Paladins after just seeing something like that happen over at Paragon? The answer here is definitely no. Paladins had been doing quite well for a while in between and then kind of went down a little bit, but either way we've seen that Smite is definitely still up there and it's definitely still one of Hi-Rez's big focuses and will remain for at least a while, at least now that Season 5 is released. Likewise, with Paladins Battlegrounds, we don't even know how that game is going to develop yet. At the moment, we're in the very early stages. There's some pay-to-win stuff going around and whatnot, so we'll see how that unfolds, but it's very unlikely that that's going to take away from Smite, which is in a completely different genre, etc. Some other things that are maybe crucial to mention when coming into Smite outside of the differences and all the other stuff we've talked about is how important jungle buffs are, because in Smite they are incredibly important, especially on a competitive level but also on a casual level. They're often highly contested points on the map, and in the upcoming season we'll probably see them be contested even more, even though there is more farm on the map in general and they respawn faster, denying a buff becomes a lot more potent through that as well. The wide variety of buffs, debuff, and CC in Smite that exists is something that you should definitely be aware of when you come into the game, because there's knockups, knockbacks, stuns, roots, mess, disarms, etc. But there are also many means of, once again, either avoiding or removing them in hindsight, basically. One of the most important ones is Purification Beads, which allows you to cleanse any crowd control that is on you, and that's literally any crowd control. There's a Magi's Blessing that gives you a bubble ever so often, which prevents it from hitting you in the first place. And there is Mantle of Discord that will make you crowd control immune if you get below a certain level of health. Then there are also specific cleanses, like for example Ulr's Weapon Swap, allowing him to remove disarms, or just cleanses that characters can do on others, like Hel's ability that's literally called Cleanse. What's also very important going into Smite is utilizing wards. Wards win games in Smite, and if you don't have the vision, it's gonna be a problem, even more so in the new season where we have fog in the jungle as well, so buy wards. We have a VGS system in Smite. It's a voice-guided system which will give you the possibility to communicate with your allies without writing things, just by a few keystrokes. It's a bit different from Paragon, what some would say a bit more efficient, because you just have to hit those keys. And that is something you should definitely learn to utilize over time as well, as many people do. If you want to learn more about Smite, it's also definitely worth checking out streams. Many of the pro players frequently stream and sometimes upload replays to YouTube as well. Some of them also have content channels that provide you with a bit more info, and that's something that will definitely help you get into the game if you are absolutely lost regarding everything. And with that, we're coming to the end of the video. LHS, is there anything else that you have to say?
Just that if you're coming from Paragon, there's going to be lots of differences, but keep an open mind. A lot of us who came from Smite to Paragon kept the open mind. You know, the deck system being very different, the item system being very different for you coming in, and then the jungle being probably one of the biggest ones with the fog doors. There's a lot of key differences, but a lot of the same mechanics still apply. And if you find yourself at a lack for information, or you're just not understanding, there's a wealth of information in the community. You just got to go look and find it.
And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. Thank you, LHS, for joining me on this. If you haven't checked out LHS channels, once again, the links are all down below. You can check him out there, see what he's up to these days. And I thank you again for joining me here. And I will see you again for the next video tomorrow, hopefully. If you're a new switching person, I would appreciate, if you stick around, maybe sub here as well, so that you can get some more info on Smite, and just say hi in the comments down below. See you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out. So I actually figured out my demonetization issue, and it was my outro. As such, feel free to click any of the links around here right now. There will be new outro music as soon as I find something nice. Until then, as you guys requested, I will do the outro music myself. You're welcome.